HOA storytime, tenant handles a Karen neighbor in a very creative and funny way. So, unfortunately, one of my rentals shares the same courtyard as this old Karen, who, for the lack of better description, has nothing better to do but to be the community mall cop and to report people who violate every HOA rule to the board. It's obvious that she's been there for a long time as the original owner, and she hates the tenants and investors, and uses her free time to try and annoy and pester anyone in the community that is not owner-occupied. My tenants are a couple, professional with a toddler, very respectful, and just all-out good people. So, a few months ago, I start getting an inch of HOA violation notices for the stupidest crap. I get one because they left their baby stroller outside in the private patio. HOA rules say that private patio is not supposed to be used as a place of storage. And then, another HOA notice about leaving a shoe rack outside of their doorstep, and another notice about leaving an Amazon open box on the patio. It is annoying as heck, and every single time my immigrant tenants apologize, and I'm like, what the heck are you apologizing for? You didn't do anything wrong. Some butthole is being petty. So every single time I go to the HOA board meeting, and then I argue these stupid write-ups, I'm like, hey, what the heck? I point out a dozen or so other units, they have a lot more crap on their patio, and they don't get violations, and then threaten to sue the board for selective enforcement of HOA rules, discrimination, and financial damage to me from the constant harassment. They usually back off then and say, never mind. So one day, I get a call from them, and they say that this old lady neighbor was there, complaining to them about how they left some beach towels and a wetsuit outside on a temporary drying rack to dry, and they can't use the patio for that. Holy crap, she's been the one that's been complaining all this time. So I go over there, thinking just the worst, thinking that my tenant has this huge old 6-foot tall drying rack hanging similar to the one that I have at home, and putting out their underwear on it, only to see, when I get there, there's like a 2-foot tall drying rack that's lower than the retaining wall of the patio that you can't even see unless you're literally within 5 feet from the patio peeking over. I was thinking, you gotta be kidding me, really? So I'm talking to this old lady that has nothing better to do. I'm like, look, Karen, you can't even see anything from your patio. The only way you can see this is if you're within 5 feet. Just go around and don't bother them and we won't bother you, okay? But no, she has to make her point, which is be an HOA rule jerk, and report both me and the tenant to the HOA board. And so I'm like, just fine, you do that, lady. So I go home, I'm just fuming that this old lady is wasting my time and my tenant's time on stupid crap. I find my 6-foot tall laundry rack, I drop it off at my tenant's place, and I set it up in the backyard patio and tell him, please, air dry all of your clothes for the next week, especially underwear. And if this lady reports it, let her. Screw her. Here's a Starbucks gift card for your inconvenience of not using the dryer. Reluctantly they did, and yes, I got written up twice for the same thing, which means that it included a $200 fine. So I go to the HOA board meeting. The Karen lady is there complaining about how my tenants hung clothes outside 2 times now, despite getting a warning. When the board asked me, I said, yeah, that's correct. And it's their legal right to do that in this state. Confused, the board asked me, what do I mean? And I told them, well, in this state, thanks to AB 1448, CVC 1940.20, and 4750.10, also known as the Right to Dry Law, an HOA cannot legally ban hanging laundry outside, nor can they have them any rules that prevent tenants or owners from hanging laundry outside. No different than legally an HOA cannot outright ban anyone from putting a satellite dish outside. The HOA can impose rules governing how drying racks or satellite dishes can be placed. For example, rules stating that such things cannot be permanently attached to common area or building structure, but they cannot outright ban them, and those rules specifically have to describe the details of those restrictions in order to be enforceable. Your HOA rules governing laundry, clothes, and so on predates AB 1448, which was created for energy conservation by encouraging people not to run a dryer, and has no details on the restrictions of when temporary drying racks can or can't be used. So your rule violates state's laws, and it's not enforceable. My tenant only needs permission to use drying racks, and they have my permission, please note. Talk to your attorneys, because I already talked to mine. The HOA board concludes with a, "We'll get back to you, Mr. X." and I don't hear about it for a few days. And then, finally, I get a call that says, "Our attorneys reviewed your complaint, and in a nutshell, as long as the drying racks are not being permanently attached, state law says that you can have an outdoor drying rack." So, after I got that from the HOA board, was I being a vindictive butt when I gave my tenants a Starbucks gift card while asking them for a favor to hang some underwear on a 6-foot-tall drying rack outside for 2 months to crap on the Karen neighbor? Also, was I a bigger butt when Karen contacted me to complain further, and I told her, "Well, if it bothers you so much, you can get one of those patio wind shades to block your view so you don't see my tenants' underwear. But if you do that, and if I see it when I'm checking up on my property, I'm going to have to report you to the HOA, because, unfortunately, patio wind shades are not a state law protected class of apparatus from the HOA rules, which clearly bans these wind shades. Have a nice day." This is a perfect example, as our friend Rick Astley says, "You know the rules, and so do I." What would you do? HOA lawyer story time. Client walks into the office and asks us for a contract review. He then hands over an HOA contract. Before slogging through a whole HOA contract, I asked him what he was hoping to accomplish. "They want me to dig up my sunflowers." "Your sunflowers?" "Yes, I planted a row of sunflowers outside my house, and they pranced by and said that sunflowers are not allowed per the contract that I signed. So, I want you to tell me if that is true or not." "Sir, before anything else, I need to tell you that this will likely be an hourly fee bill. HOAs are notorious for dragging things out, so these could quickly become expensive sunflowers." "I don't care. This is America, and I should be able to plant sunflowers, dang it." Still thinking he wasn't that serious about sunflowers, I asked for a 3-hour retainer. He immediately pulled out a checkbook and paid for 4 hours. So I buckled down to review the alleged anti-sunflower clause. Just for reference, the sunflowers he wanted to plant were really big, like 5 feet, and all along the front of the house. It was a very substantial amount of sunflowers. The contract did indeed contain a clause, with a very thorough list on which plants were and were not allowed to be planted. The list had just about every plant I could think of in alphabetical order, so think like apple, banana, cauliflower, dill, and so on. Sunflowers included. Corn was not included, which becomes very important later. Quick legal point. If you write "no dogs allowed," it's normally assumed that you're talking about all dogs generally. If you write "no labs, golden retrievers, or poodles allowed," it's normally assumed that all other dogs are allowed. Sometimes a not great attorney will write a super long list to pad hours. Read "charge more" instead of just writing "no plants without prior approval" or something. So I called the client back in for the bad news. In explaining the above legal point, I let him know that the HOA got a raw deal from whoever drafted the contract. No can do on the sunflowers, but if it makes you feel any better, they were probably overbilled by whoever wrote this contract. Pretty shoddy work too. They even forgot to write down corn, but they included nonsense like dragon fruit. So yes to corn, no to sunflowers? I didn't really check the contract for corn, but it's not prohibited in the plant section, so probably? Excellent, that'll work. I thought he was oddly happy with bad news. And then, 2 or 3 weeks later, he came in with a picture of his house surrounded by huge sunflowers. What happened? The guy drove out to the country and bought obnoxiously large and ugly corn stalks. He promptly planted them where the sunflowers had been. When confronted by the HOA, he told them, paraphrasing, to "suck it, the contract lets me plant corn." And then, after some negotiation, he agreed to take the corn down in exchange for permission to plant sunflowers. Now we are friends, he's still a great client, and he lives surrounded by a ridiculous moat of sunflowers. As we get into the next story, I have to tell you something. Hey, also I added more stories to the new 24/7 HOA Karen radio stream on the channel, perfect to binge or play for background noise while you sleep. Check out the link in the description or on the front page of the channel. It looks like this. Being considered an unauthorized boarder by the HOA, posted by Motive Labrosse, with updates and drama in the comments. Well, over a decade ago, I was forced to move back in with my dad. I was only planning to stay a few months till I was financially stable enough to get my own place once again. but my dad insisted that I stay rent-free while I got my car paid off and some serious dental work done. This lasted 4 years. My dad owns a really nice place in a subdivision that had an HOA. For about 2 of those 4 years, things went fine, until a woman who I shall aptly call Karen became head of the HOA. Me and Karen had many unfortunate run-ins in the past. She would constantly ask my dad how long until I move out. Then she would always report me and my dad to the HOA for the silliest things, which the HOA would usually ignore or at best dismiss after getting our side of the story. But now that she was in control, she took direct action. The first was to declare me an unauthorized boarder after instituting a bylaw that all adults 21 and older in a household have to be registered with the HOA as a permanent resident with a minimum of 5 years that they have to stay without penalizing the homeowner. My dad refused to do any such thing because I would eventually be getting my own place. But Karen insisted, even serving him 2 years of backdated penalties for having me there. My dad ended up having to spend money on a lawyer to send her a cease and desist order because I was legally grandfathered in since I was there before the bylaw. Of course, the fines were begrudgingly dropped, but afterwards she would try to nickel and dime my dad with constant little things like me being out at all hours of the night, well, I worked late, or the way I dressed in public being inappropriate, jeans and band t-shirts mostly, and other stupid crap that most of which weren't in the bylaws. She even took to using a selfie stick over the fence to see if there was anything in the backyard violating the rules. I since moved out of there, and a year or so later, Karen was voted out of the HOA after ticking off the wrong people. Update and drama. One commenter asked OP, "I'd like to know what person held the gun to your head and said that you must move back in with your dad. Chances are, it sounds like you messed up in life, and this was the easy and convenient thing for you to do. Yes, this HOA was bad, but do a bit of self-reflecting and come to terms with the fact that this wouldn't have even been a thing if it wasn't for your life decisions." And OP fires back with, "Nice to know you're freaking psychic. If you must know, there was some bad blood between me and my at-the-time roommate's psychopath, now ex-wife, and it got to the point that I didn't feel safe living in the same apartment with her. The lease had to be broken, and it drained me out of a ton of cash. My pop was good enough to give me a temporary roof over my head. Otherwise, I'd be homeless. I was only planning on spending a couple months at my pop's place till I was on my feet, but he insisted that I stay until my car was paid off and I got some much-needed dental work done. Crazy story, and be sure not to assume things about people's situation, right? You know what they say that makes you. My HOA will learn that I absolutely live by the letter of the law. My HOA recently changed the rules limiting the amount of vehicles allowed in my driveway. I collect cars, all of which run, drive, and are registered and insured, and my household also has 4 licensed drivers. When I moved in, the rules stated only 1 Class C vehicle allowed per driveway. Well, that was fine by me since Class C vehicles don't exist. Class C vehicles were not defined in the HOA rules either. I assume whoever wrote that rule assumed since they had a Class C license, standard cars and trucks must be Class C. So I moved in, and after stuffing 2 cars, 4 motorcycles, and my camper in the garage, I placed 5 vehicles in my driveway. The letters came. I was quickly able to deflate them after asking them for the legal definition of a Class C vehicle. No fines paid. Fast forward for about a year, and the HOA proposed a rule change, now stating 3 vehicles per driveway maximum, and since 3 is more than 1 and people lack critical thinking skills, it was passed with over 85% support. Fine, 3 vehicles it is. I did some digging and I found the streets in my HOA were turned over to the city, an effort to avoid having to foot the maintenance bill, I'm sure, and as such, the HOA had no authority to stop people from parking on a public street. So I moved 2 vehicles then to my very narrow street. one in front of my house and one directly across the street in front of my neighbor's house. Now, the only vehicles that could safely drive past my home were motorcycles and the one guy with a smart car. It was glorious. My street is a main artery into and out of the neighborhood. Lots of U-turns and backtracking for folks to get home or to work. They are the ones who did the rest of the work for me. Complaints and calls to the HOA president resulted in another rule change vote. Now, my driveway is open to any amount of legally registered vehicles. It fits 9. I need more cars. Do you agree with this? I'm kind of surprised that last part worked. You can certainly park on a public street, but not usually in such a way that you block said street. Yeah, how did OP pull this off? Let me know in the comments. Torture a student and lose your whole career in the process. Posted by Nanobot0991. I work in a healthcare facility with different disciplines, and we have the main clinicians and assistants as well that do treatment. For the longest time before a pandemic, clinicians would take students from schools because they need to have some hands-on experience before they graduate and get to take their state exams. The players of this are: OP is me, Dory is a clinician teacher, Hannah is a student, Casey is another clinician, and Katie is my regional manager. So I am the supervisor of the health clinic and am in charge of all clinicians. Even though they're fairly independent, they have to report to me, and I, in turn, report for the whole clinic. This starts with Dory. She has a lot of friends in one of the prominent universities here. She's very well connected with them, and she graduated from there. Is involved with their activities and just active in the school in general. I have known Dory for years and have worked with her before, but she was never directly under my management because her home clinic was another location she would just help out. I would hear things about her, the way she treated the assistants that worked under her, a rudeness towards other clinicians, and some sketchy stuff about basically fraud of billing for services not rendered. This is a big no in healthcare, but it happens more than you think. Anyway, I had no proof of this, and all the patients at my clinic had not voiced any complaints. Anyway, Dory had started taking students in, and she was moved at my clinic. When she came there, she was still helping at another clinic not too far away. Dory accepted a student from her university to follow her and learn from her and slowly integrate into clinical treatment. This is where Hannah enters into the picture, a very shy girl and did everything you asked of her, but because she was shy and also being a new student, she's unsure if the treatment she's administering is the appropriate one. That's why you have people like Dory to be next to you and counsel and guide you. After the first few weeks, I started noticing Hannah would be in the clinic and would be doing treatments without Dory being around for a few hours. This isn't allowed because the instructor should be around at all times to supervise their students. After a few times of noticing this, I brought Dory and H into my office and said this cannot happen and is not allowed. If it happens again, I would have to report it, and this was not something I wanted to do. If I did report it, the student would lose their clinical placement and would have to wait 6 months until the next placement, which pushes back the graduating date. A few weeks go by, and things had been fairly normal. The student would be in the clinic sooner, but would not be performing treatment. She would, however, shadow other clinicians. But Dory was still coming in later than usual. One day, as I'm walking by Hannah, I see her that she's on the billing menu. In order to be on that screen, you would have to be clocked in, otherwise the system won't allow you to do it. I call her to my office again, and I sternly tell her that I had specifically said she couldn't treat patients and she doesn't have a clock-in username and password. Hannah proceeded to tell me that Dory had told her to clock in for her and start billing patients before services were rendered. Continues to state that this had been going on for the whole time she had been a student. Now, I don't see the billing until the next day, but I don't have a clock of when the billing was submitted. I tell Hannah that this was strictly not allowed, but I need more information before I make a decision. I call Casey, the other clinicians, into my office, and she proceeds to tell me that Hannah goes home crying and bawling every single night due to Dory threatening to fail her as a student if she didn't do all these things for her. Dory had used her leverage in her school to strong-arm Hannah into doing all her work while she wasn't even there. I asked Hannah if this was true, and she said yes, it was. Hannah then goes to tell me that after the first meeting with Dory, Hannah, and OP on what they shouldn't be doing, Dory brought Hannah to the side and told her, "He's cool, he knows what's really going on, but he has to say that as a manager, so keep doing it." At this point, I asked the student if any of her evaluation or letters of progress had been submitted to her school so they know she has been making progress. Hannah says that Dory has never submitted the necessary paperwork to the school and has gotten away with it because of her connections to the school. So, if I fired Dory, she would, in turn, take revenge on the student and fail her at the clinical. She would be 6 months to a year from being placed into another clinic, meaning she would be either very late or just fail and not be able to graduate. I called Katie and reported everything to her, told her my fear for the student and the constant trauma she was going through every day, crying, being threatened, and retaliated against. Katie was also fearful of this, but also worried the liability this put on the company, also how long it had been going on. So she didn't have an answer on how to handle the situation without harming the student. So here was my revenge. I started watching everything Dory did, treatments, time and complaints, and so on. One weekend, Dory had to work without her student on a Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. When I come in on Monday, I notice a patient having been to the hospital since Friday, but she had still been billed for services. I checked the clinician. It was Dory. How was she able to treat a person that wasn't even in the clinic and also be able to bill her? So I had my reasons to fire her. I had the evidence I needed, but I still wanted a bit more. I texted Dory and asked if she had seen said patient. She reported yes, she had, but also asked if she had billed less than what she should have because she would be able to bill more if I wanted. I told her that wasn't necessary and there was no way to bill more due to the patient being in the hospital the whole weekend she had billed. She knew from that moment what was going to happen. The next day, OP and Katie waited for Dory and she was fired on the spot, just for the fraud. The student thing never came up in conversation and she had no idea we had known for a while. I had another clinician write up a whole letter on what the student was doing and that she was a good clinician and has completed the necessary work to be able to graduate. Dory was unable to get any more work after that because the incident had been reported to the government and had that on her license wherever she went. Her new employers would look at the license and not want to hire someone with that on her record. Last I heard, she was working at an Amazon warehouse as a manager. From a doctorate degree to warehouse manager, after many years, I'm sure, of fraud and abuse. The best part is that the student has graduated and gotten her degree and is working in the field. She's a great clinician, has done great work in her field, and I still keep in contact with her. She's very thankful for being pulled out of that situation. Thieving manager tries to frame me for their theft. It doesn't go well for them. Posted by Asmodus. The parties involved are: the store manager is Mo, thieving assistant manager is Jay, and the lead assistant manager is Travis. This story happened around 6 years ago when I worked for a retail company I will call No-Op. Jay was well known to be a thief by the base staff and some of the lower levels of management. Unfortunately, she was a golden girl to Mo and Travis, and we never had any solid proof. We also didn't get pay docked and so on unless it was over a certain amount, which it never was. So staff never had a real incentive to try and find proof. One of Jay's favorite things to steal were vouchers for money off products or shopping because you were just supposed to rip them up and put them in the safe. There was no official way of counting these to return them to the company, so she could use them again in a different store and get away with it. This particular day was Halloween, and I was on till 4, the only till with no cameras on it. Mo came up and paid for her shopping with some gift vouchers she had received at a store manager's meeting because the store was doing really well. I served her, and no one else touched my till all day because I was the main person on the tills for this shift. We closed up for the night, and Jay took the registers to be cashed up. I went out to the pub with friends and had a good night not knowing what was coming. The next shift I'm on, Mo calls me into the office and tells me that the vouchers she used were not in the safe and she knew that it was my till. She wanted me to return the vouchers and would not press charges or put anything on my file if I just returned them immediately. I, of course, did not have them and testified as such, but she didn't believe me. I went looking everywhere, the bin under till 4 and the bins outside, under the tills and on the floor around the tills, just in case I had dropped them or put them somewhere dumb while trying to sort out cash and so on. Roughly an hour later, Jay comes in, hears what's going on, and offers to look as well. She finds them in 30 seconds flat, somewhere I had already looked. I essentially hissed out, "What a coincidence that as soon as Jay looks there, she finds it immediately. How coincidental." Seething with white fury as I knew she was now framing me for her own theft. She could have found them in the office and made it a simple mistake, but no, she made me the fall guy for her own idiocy. I tried to plead my case to Mo and Travis, stating that I wouldn't be dumb enough to steal vouchers that I knew were Mo's because I was the one who served her. One of the other team leaders, Paul, knew fine and well it was Jay and tried to tell Mo and Travis that I was being set up. But she was the golden girl and could do no wrong, while my name was mud as far as they were concerned. Heck, they thought Jay had caught me in the act. This meant war. Over the next few months, I got really friendly with Jay, flirting outrageously with her and basically pretending like I really respected her and that we were good buddies. It took me a while to work my way into her trust, but once I was there, I knew I could catch her stealing and prove it. We wasted off a load of Christmas chocolate products that hadn't sold, and I put them in a bag to be put in the bin. Jay said we should take them home, against company policy and seen as stealing because they were just going to waste otherwise. We were stood underneath a camera, just outside of its range, so I said, "I don't want any, but if you want them, you can have them," and put them on a trolley just inside of the camera's range. I had studied the camera angles in great detail, preparing for a moment exactly like this. I saw her look at the camera, down at the trolley, and back to the camera before walking off to get her stuff. I warned my colleagues not to take any of the chocolate, even if offered, and had an evil grin on my face which my colleagues commented on. When Jay came down, she nonchalantly picked up the bag as if it were her shopping, offered chocolate to everyone, and walked out the door with it. Gotcha, witch. The next morning, I arrived for my shift and put on the most somber face as possible as I approached Travis. "You should check the cameras on the back door at approximately 22:21. I think you'll find what you see very interesting." He asked me to explain further, and I looked over towards where Jay was, not even 5 meters away, and looked back. "I can't go into further detail right now, but I would strongly suggest you go and look at the cameras for that time now." Travis begrudgingly walked off to do just that, and within 10 minutes, Jay was called into the office and her bag was searched. Within the hour, she was suspended pending investigation, and within the week, she was fired and barred from the store. I got a full apology from the managers who didn't believe me, who explained that they genuinely believed it was me and had no idea Jay could possibly have been a thief. Their jaws hit the floor after I explained that every member of staff knew she was a thief, but that we didn't feel like we could do anything about it. After going around asking people if this was true, I got another apology. 6 months later, I was offered training to become a team leader myself. I took it, but ended up quitting for a white-collar role in a different company before I finished my training. Boss didn't pay me, so I started a company out of spite to put him out of business, posted by a deleted account. The year was 2008, and I was 9 years into operating a landscape company. I had done moderately well for myself, being able to purchase a home, pay off student loans, and start a family. I employed 4 people during what I call the work season, which for us is March through November. December through February, we lay off our workers and go on hiatus for the most part. Side note, our company is focused mainly on maintenance and in the Pacific Northwest. Once all the leaves are picked up from the autumn, there really isn't much maintenance to be done. I had, that year, developed a relationship with a home builder who hired me to care for his personal home and very much liked our work. He asked us to start bidding on installing the landscapes to the homes he built. Sounds easy, right? Well, remember, we focused mainly on maintenance, so my crew didn't have a ton of experience in the install detail of landscape, and the homes this guy built were not track homes or your cookie cutter type neighbors you find in the suburbs. No, a small home for him was 3,500 square feet on a 25,000 square foot lot, and an average size he developed was 8,500 to 10,000 square feet home with all the bells and whistles. He was more generous in his landscape budgets than many of the contractors I'd met, and we were off to what I'd hoped would be a great partnership. We finished the first 4 projects he handed us, and it was now the beginning of December when my maintenance side of things drops off. This home builder came to me and asked if I would like to keep my maintenance crew working for the winter for him. I knew his next home project wasn't set to break ground till late January, so I asked what he had in mind. He told me that he and his son had been experimenting with spray foam insulation in their homes and had decided to invest into purchasing equipment to start their own company. To purchase equipment on this level was about $100,000. I said I would talk to the crew and get back with him. The next week, we signed a contract to work with him for 3 months at a specified pay rate for 5 of us. He was confident he had enough work to keep us busy for the next 3 months. First job was insulating this incredible house for this plastic surgeon who spared no expense for the gadgets and material that he put into his home. Next was government buildings on Fort Lewis. Next was new apartment complexes, and so on and on. Now, this builder who I was friends with was not my day-to-day boss while insulating. It was his son, who is younger than I and a bit of a jerk. But we got along fine and all seemed well. The father owned the insulation company, but had very little to do with it on a day-to-day basis. I hardly saw him for 3 months. Now, being a contractor myself, I was used to not getting paychecks every 2 weeks like most working folks. I would get paid once a month for my maintenance accounts for the previous month of service, and it didn't all come in at once. Sometimes people forget to pay on time. My crew, though, was used to getting paid in a timely manner, and after the first month of work and receiving no check from my new boss, I inquired when to expect a check. He assured me that once the check started rolling in, that we would see our money. I totally get how that works, especially for a new company trying to get off the ground. So I paid my guys to keep the peace on my end, and my boss and I worked out an agreement that I would keep track of everything paid and that he would cut me a check once he was able to. I also had an outstanding landscape invoice out with the father of over $10,000 that I wasn't really worried about because he was not always super quick about payment. Not that I had to hound him about it, but you understand. Now, we are at the end of February 2009, and it was time to gear up for the new season of landscape maintenance and put my crew back to work outside. Still no payment from insulation or the last landscape project. Things got ugly real fast as I started daily phone calls to the son now that we didn't see each other as often. I called the father, who more or less ignored me. The son stopped answering my calls and texts, and the father never had a straight answer for me. Now, mid-April of 2009, most communication has stopped on their end. I filed a contractor's lien on the landscape project to be paid out before the house sold, which prompted a call from the father to invite me to his home for lunch and talk. I accepted, thinking he was going to offer me a deal of some kind based on my past history with him. He basically told me that he had been over the years screwed out of money by different people and that it was something that I was going to have to learn to live with. My response: well, I've been screwed out of money that people owe me as well, just not by anyone I considered a friend. I left his house determined to stick it to him. May 5th, 2009, I started a spray foam insulation company with the same level of equipment that he had, but about a year less experience than he had. May 7th, I get a call from the father asking a landscape question, acting as if we were on normal terms. My response was, "Oh, I don't landscape anymore, I spray foam." "What are you talking about?" he asked. When I explained to him that I was operating a spray foam insulation company, he ended the phone call rather quickly. I then received a phone call from his son 5 minutes later, who had ignored my calls for the last many weeks, threatening me that he would destroy my hopes of making it as an insulator and that no little landscaper could or would make it in this community. Side note, with my newly formed company, there was now approximately 4 to 5 companies in the Pacific Northwest performing this kind of service. It's a small circle of people in the insulation world, and the word gets around pretty quick who does what and so on. Our very first job was handed to us by our material supplier, which happened to be his supplier, and that job was a fix. Apparently, that very first job we'd worked on, that plastic surgeon's house, was insulated incorrectly and poor workmanship. Luckily, my only involvement on that house was prep work and cleanup. We ended up remodeling all of the insulation and reinstalling it. About a $65,000 job, which the owner of the house turned around and sued my old boss for and won. We then acquired the government contract at Fort Lewis that he had because of poor communication on his part. Anyway, we systematically took apart his company by being better and honest with people. The story spread in the spray foam insulation world, and we became somewhat hero-like in this region because they had screwed so many people over. Oh, and at that time, if you might remember, the housing market took a giant dump, and guess who had 4 very large houses sitting out there that couldn't sell? Yup, the father, who ended up going bankrupt by mid-09. The son, on the other hand, kept his head above water somehow a bit longer. But in October of 09, I got a call from a repo man asking if I knew the son and where to find his spray foam equipment. My father-in-law happened to be a retired cop and PI, and I put him on the case to find said equipment. 2 days later, he called with the address and specific location of the equipment, which was behind a barn on an island with the tires aired down. I made the call to the repo man, and 2 hours later, he called me from his lot as he was pulling in with a very large trailer behind his truck, asking where he could send the bounty check. I kept the insulation business for about 3 years before being bought out by another company. I also kept the landscape company and still run it to this day. Moral of the story, landscapers may work in the dirt and seem simple, but tick one off and they will ruin you. Kinda my revenge, kinda my sister's. Both of us really proud. This is going to be long, so TLDR at the bottom. Here's our cast. My sister, we'll call her Sarah for the story. Sarah's ex-boyfriend, Paul. Ex-boyfriend's new wife, Jane. Ex-boyfriend's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Doe. And oldest brother, Zeke. Our parents and me. When I was 14, my oldest sister, Sarah, was 22, we found out that she was pregnant with Paul, her boyfriend of 4 years. They immediately got engaged and they were really happy. For a time. Sarah had a horrible pregnancy. About 16 to 18 weeks in the wonder of creating a human life evaporated within her. She developed hyperemesis, which, if you don't know, is really bad morning sickness. She was constantly in pain. She developed gestational diabetes and just all around hated the experience. Around this time, Paul, the then fiance, started getting sick of the complaining. I believe his argument was, "Your body is built to do this, it can't be that bad." Sarah was due around Valentine's Day, and Paul's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Doe, were very excited, both about the grandkid and the fact that he could be born on a holiday. She was very against that and really hoped that her son wouldn't be born on a holiday, even one as small as Valentine's Day. See, her birthday falls sometimes on Easter, and she hates it, because it might make him feel that his day isn't very much about him. Well, Mrs. Doe says something like, "Well, if you name him Valentine or Valentino, then that'll make the day even more special to him." Again, my sister hated the idea. She thought it was tacky, he'd be bullied for it, and just really didn't like the name Valentino. Paul loved it, but agreed to go with a more average name like Daniel or Jared. Fast forward to February, and she was ready to get this over with. Sarah had officially been put on bed rest because while standing or walking, her blood pressure took unexpected spikes and dips. I look back now and goodness do I feel bad for her. She was doing her best to avoid giving birth on Valentine's Day because, again, she didn't want him born on a holiday. Unfortunately, births happen when they happen, and that baby was going to come on Valentine's Day whether she wanted him to or not. I remember waiting out in the waiting room with my dad, brothers, and Paul, who couldn't stand to be in the delivery room because it was gross. I was so mad that he could have gone in but wouldn't because he thought my sister was gross while giving birth, whereas I had to stay outside because I was too young to go in with my mom and other sister. Dad went home with the youngest 2 brothers while the oldest, Zeke, stayed to watch me because I refused to leave. 16 hours after Sarah went into labor, my little nephew was officially part of the family on the evening of Valentine's Day. Unfortunately, Sarah was not okay. She had to have an emergency cesarean section, and while doing the operation, discovered that the back of her uterus, facing the spinal cord, had a very large and very severe, thankfully non-cancerous, tumor. When I say large, I mean it was twice the size of a standard uterus. The doctors were shocked and didn't understand why nobody had noticed it on an ultrasound. It accounted for her severe back pain and blood pressure issues. The doctors immediately went in for more surgery to remove the tumor, but sadly ended up having to perform a full hysterectomy. This meant that my nephew would be Sarah's only child. Now, while Sarah was in for surgery, Paul was taking care of everything baby-related to make sure his son was okay. In my 14-year-old self's memory, I remember him being suitably distraught, but I didn't really pay him much mind and spent my time in the waiting room with my mother and other sister. Zeke, however, wanted to be a good future brother-in-law and make sure that Paul was okay. He found Paul filling out the baby paperwork on his own, looking, in my brother's words, like he had not a single worry in his mind. Zeke asked why Paul didn't wait for Sarah to fill out the paperwork, as she should have been put out of surgery within the hour, and Paul said that he just wanted her to get her rest and heal. That checked out with Zeke, as he was 16 and didn't know any better at the time. Now, I know you're probably thinking, no he wouldn't, he knows how much she hates that name. And still, she'd need to sign the paperwork too. My fellow peoples of Reddit, I regret to inform you that Paul forged Sarah's signature on the paperwork and waited until she was out of surgery to hand said paperwork over. My sweet nephew that was born on Valentine's Day was named Valentino on his first official birth certificate. I still to this day don't know why Paul and his family were so insistent about the name. He had even picked out a different one with my sister. And before you ask, no, he was never brought up on forgery charges because his parents were witnesses to her signing the papers, even though they only got there at the last minute. So, Sarah dumped him and got her son's name changed a month later. She was willing to do split custody with him because that's her son's father and she wants the kid to know him. But Paul vanished and she never heard anything back, which seemed weirdly out of character to us. Until a mutual friend on Facebook was tagged in his wedding picture 6 months later. Paul had apparently started cheating on her not long after she got pregnant. Sarah was livid, but there wasn't much she could do, so she filed for child support and continued to live her best life. Until 6 years later. This is where the revenge starts, my friends. So, Sarah has been a single mother for the past 6 years and has been amazing at it. At this point in my career, I've been a hairdresser for about 8 months at our local Great Clips. I'm working one day, and who is seated before me but Jane, Paul's wife, herself. I take her back for a trim, and she clearly has no idea who I am. That adds up because a mutual friend that still keeps in contact with Paul said that Jane doesn't know a thing. She has no idea about Sarah, that she was the other woman, or that Paul actually has a kid that he's been, infrequently, paying child support for. She's in the dark on it all. I told myself not to be a butt and treat her like a normal customer, which I did. Now, at this point, Jane was heavily pregnant, so a lot of our conversation was about that. She loved being pregnant, but it was hard. Her husband was so unsympathetic, big shocker, and she was due in 10 weeks and they still hadn't picked out a name for their baby girl. Ladies and gentle peoples, this was my chance. I asked what kind of name she was looking for, and she said, I want something unique and unusual, but not ridiculous like Brant Lely. You know the ones I'm talking about. And Paul had suggested so many already, and she didn't like any of them. So I, the conniving little weasel I am, said, what about Sarah? My sister's name isn't actually Sarah. She was named after an older family member that passed not long after she was born. But there was no female equivalent for his name, so our parents just created one. It's a beautiful name, and it's just what Jane was looking for. She loved it. She stuck by it, and I found out by stalking her Facebook months later that she had put her foot down about it, and that was their daughter's name. Now Paul has a daughter with his ex's name to remind him every day about her, and also to remind him to pay his freaking child support. Little nephew is 10 years old now with a new name and no contact with his biological father, though we do sometimes still call him Val as a family nickname. He likes it, but doesn't want to bring it to school, so it's staying a family nickname. Sarah pretends to hate when we call him that in a joking way. As long as he likes it, she doesn't have a problem with it. And she's seeing a new guy who's really great and like a father to Val. Giant Golden Archway, posted by Zenith Blade 115. Back in 2010, I got a job working for a company that has an unofficial food item where you put $1 menu sandwich into another. I worked there for a year and a half. During that time, I learned everything. I could open, close, work the grill very well, and work front counter and drive-thru as well, if not better, than most that work there on a consistent basis. I'd been promised a review when I was hired that was to take place after 6 months of being there. Being the kind of employee that wants to move up in the company, I never pushed the issue, but instead kept pushing to learn everything I could so that when I did get my review, I would get a good one. In my time there, I called off once because I was recovering from emergency surgery to get rid of a pilonidal cyst that had ruptured. On the same token, I was always the first to volunteer to pick up a shift if it didn't interfere with my college classes. After being there a year and a half, they announced that everyone would be getting a review. My general manager came to me and told me the time she wanted to schedule me for my raise. I told her at that time that I would be needing a quarter raise to $10 a week in order to make it so I could sustain working there while going to college, and she said she understood. When my review came, I was floored. Despite all of the work I had put in and the energy I had poured into my job hoping to reach management while going to college, she assessed me as a meets expectations employee. I don't mean to sound cocky, but I knew my own value as an employee. I knew I more than exceeded expectations of an employee of that company, and I said as much. She tried to claim it was based on the consensus of the other managers, but I knew myself to be a favorite employee of every manager but her. She then told me that she would be giving me a 15-cent raise. I told her that I'd requested a quarter, and she said that 15 cents was the best she could do. The wheels turned in my head, and I knew I was undervalued by her, and I would never have a chance to move up. So I told her that I would be putting in my 2 weeks' notice. She looked at me as if I had slapped her and said, "You're leaving over 10 cents?" I looked her right in the eyes and I said, "No, you are losing a fully cross-trained employee that loves her job over 10 cents. I then stood up and walked out to my car. I did write out a 2 weeks' notice and immediately began looking for work. During my search, when she worked with me, she'd frequently tell me how someone of my experience couldn't hope to get a job making the $8 that I'd requested of them. Well, I did, and then some. I applied to a gas station that was obsessed with the letter Z on the East Coast and was to work in their kitchen overnight. I'd be making $12 an hour if I got the job. I called literally every day until I got an interview. I had my interview the night of my last call and was given the job on the spot. With 5 days left on my notice, I informed her that I'd gotten a job, where I'd gotten it, and how much I'd be making. If looks could kill, I'd have never been able to start at my other job because of the dirt that I'd be buried under. To get back at me, she wanted the one thing that I treasured most. As an employee working for that company, they'd give you pins that you could put on your hat to show your accomplishments. In a year and a half, I'd earned over 30 pins. I was proud of them and considered them a collection. She told me that after my last shift, I'd have to return my uniforms and all of my pins. I claimed that the pins were mine as payment for things that I'd done, but she told me that she would make sure I'd be docked the cost of my pins out of my last paycheck if I didn't return them. She did it. Despite everything that I'd worked for to turn this in my favor, she got under my skin. So I decided to get her back. Not wanting to completely burn a bridge, I came up with an idea that I can confidently say was my own, but had been done before on some shows that I'd never seen at the time. I decided to suspend them in Jell-O. The night before my last shift, I cooked up a large bowl of Jell-O. Before putting it in the fridge, I tied strings around my pins and suspended them at various points throughout the bowl by taping the string ends to the outside of the bowl. I let it cool overnight. After I finished my last shift, I told my manager that I was running home to get my uniforms and pins. I returned a half an hour later with my Jell-O overturned onto a plate. I'll always miss you, plate. And then I put the uniforms on the floor next to her desk and, looking her dead in the eye, placed the Jell-O on her desk and said, "Here's your pins." I walked out without waiting for her response and decided never to go there again. My roommate, who also worked there, told me that it was all her coworkers could talk about all day. I was at least able to take some satisfaction in the fact that maybe I would inspire some other shenanigans from my coworkers if they, too, decided that company was not for them. As a reminder, people don't quit bad jobs, they quit bad managers. HR didn't want to have an awkward conversation with a couple of people, so we all get extra days off. Posted by Magnus40. The company I worked for had quite an old-fashioned attitude to the workplace. The workplace was divided into boiler suits and suits, or workshops and office. They regarded office as educated, professional, and honest, and workshop as stupid, halfway done, and petty thieves. This was not a view that I agreed with. I had come from a company where everyone from janitor to general manager were treated the same and could have an input. If something went wrong in design or manufacturing, it was often the guy working the machine or fitted the parts who spotted it and came up with the correction. In my new place, the office would not accept input from workshop unless they really had to. Workshop had to clock and account for every minute, whereas office were on the honor system. We were trusted to input our own hours, and we usually just entered our 8 hours per day, despite usually working more, sometimes a lot more, because we were professional in our work ethic. In my old place, everyone clocked. It was no big deal, but suggesting that it happened here was like suggesting that the office workers were untrustworthy. Then there was Bob. Bob turned up about 8:30 and left about 3:30 and somehow managed to log 8 hours per day. We had a half-hour lunch break. We could extend it, but had to log it and work the time back. He took long lunches of about an hour or so. He was also a heavy smoker, and about 3 to 4 times an hour, Bob would pop outside for a smoke. Everyone knew about Bob, including HR. We knew that Bob was on a shaky peg for a while because his working hours were getting shorter and shorter while still being charged at 8 hours. Something had to give. HR had an easy job. Have a word with Bob and get him to work the hours he claimed, put him on an RA or remedial action plan, or else fire him for misaccounting hours. Instead, HR decided to instigate a new policy that everyone on site would clock and would have to account for their hours on site. At no point did HR actually talk to anyone in the office. They just seemed to come up with this plan based on what they think went on. Engineering were generally unhappy with this, although a few did grumble about honor and trust. HR just shrugged their shoulders and shifted the blame on the European Working Time Directive and said that it was the new normal, nothing we can do. Honest. You don't BS engineers because we like rules, and sure enough, some of the engineering team researched it and found out that HR was just using the EU law to railroad through a new process. We did need to record worked hours, but nowhere did it say that we had to use an electronic clocking system to do it. The old system fulfilled the requirement of the law just fine. The new clocking machines were fitted in every entrance to the office block. We were all given swipe cards and training on using the new system. We could have pointed it out to HR, and indeed some people tried, but the decision had already been made and they pushed ahead with it. We all knew what was coming, and we continued on as normal, waiting for the end of the month. At the end of the month, the project billing controllers went nuts. While 1 or 2 people were genuinely stealing time from the company, the rest of us were under-accounting for our time. Engineering were on a flexible working day. As long as we did core hours and did our 8 hours, then we were okay. Anything over 8 hours was banked, and at the end of the month was either paid as overtime or flexi time. I nominally started at 7 a.m., but I was usually in by 6:40, and we worked to the job so I could leave at 3:30, but it was often closer to 4. Most of us were the same, but we usually just rounded to an 8-hour day. Suddenly, the projects lost 3 or 4 hours of free overtime per person per week with an office of around 300 people. That's a hit load of time, and that had to be paid out as OT or banked as flexi as per our contract. One or two of the managers suggested that we adjust our time to the previous hours, but falsifying clocking hours was gross misconduct and a sackable offense, so they went back in their box pretty quickly. HR told us to log our time accurately, and so we did. HR refused to back down because EU law, which we knew that this was rubbish, and so the productivity figures went down, in some cases by over 10%. Cost went up as we had to be credited with all the extra time, and so we all got at least one flexi day per month that we never had before. Thanks, HR. All you needed to do was to have a word with Smokey Bob and his like, and all would be well. But because you wanted to avoid an awkward conversation, we all get extra holidays. Woohoo! Office appropriate attire, posted by Richie65. This was about 5 years ago. Setting the stage. I had been with this massive global company, one of its manufacturing divisions, for about 7 years. I was Tier 3 plus IT support, mostly behind the scenes stuff and online meetings with folks. On call as well. The guy who hired, Steve, department director, was great. I was, and still am, a jeans and t-shirt. I have like 200 plus silkscreen tees. Nothing offensive, but pleasantly entertaining. Steve decided to exit the corporate world. I did not want his job, so massive global company found and hired a new director. Jay and I got along well, I thought, but then I started to see that he was intimidated by my skill set and ability to resolve issues with either a PowerShell script that I already had or by a command line, very quickly fixing issues in a matter of seconds using methods that he could not understand. He was a GUI person. Jay started looking for things to discipline me for. And here we go. Jay decided that my wearing t-shirts was unprofessional. I said, "What do you mean by unprofessional?" Jay said, "It gives the impression to others that you don't respect them and they don't think they can trust you to do your job correctly." Others? Who? Who thinks I can't do my job? Look, I'm not going to argue this. You need to come to work in office-appropriate attire, period. So, I'm not capable of doing my job unless I'm wearing office-appropriate attire, not allowed to do my job unless that is how I'm dressed? Jay bluntly and dismissively said, "That's it." I said, "Well then, I need to add this kind of specific detail to this write-up." Yeah, he was putting it on paper, so I added that to my comment. Management determined, explained to me, and I now understand that I am not able to perform my work-related tasks in a professional manner unless I'm wearing office-appropriate attire. Then, for about 3 weeks, slacks and polo shirts. On a Friday night, I get a call at about 11:15 p.m., since remember, I'm on call. There's an issue affecting multiple production lines. None of the computers are connecting to the network. They can't print labels and blah blah blah. My plan comes into full effect. Full circle ensues. I tell the production supervisor that I can't do anything about it. Really, I just needed to run a script that bounces DHCP on a domain controller, but I digress. Because I am not wearing office-appropriate attire, and he knew what I was referring to, and all my clothes were at the dry cleaner, and that I will pick them up on my way to the gym Monday morning. That blew up tremendously, as expected. Jay calls me early Saturday morning, where I, bluntly and dismissively, tell him that this issue is his problem, not mine. He was the one who disciplined me and insisted that I was not able to do my job unless I was wearing office-appropriate attire, and that it is documented that I must be wearing office-appropriate attire in order to do my job, and that this will be happening on Monday morning after I pick up my clothes from the dry cleaner. Your rules, buddy, not mine. Have a nice weekend. Then tell me how to fix this. I'm not even wearing pants right now. I can't do work stuff. Jay angrily hangs up. Monday, I come in prepared for battle. With HR, Jay, and the plant manager in the same room, I spell out how this is going to work, as best as I can recall. If you don't like this, let me know now. If you folks don't think I can do my job wearing a t-shirt and jeans after doing my job exceptionally well for 7 years wearing a t-shirt and jeans, then this changes when Jay shows up. I promise you that what I am wearing is not the problem. Jay is. If you see it otherwise, explain it to me. HR and the plant manager say, huh, what? HR, don't play stupid. You saw that write-up and you filed it accordingly. The plant manager says, what? I explained the write-up to the plant manager. Plant manager says that this is the stupidest thing he's ever heard and ultimately blasts Jay and HR. Plant manager reassures me that this will never happen again. The write-up is garbage and that if I have any other problems to let him know. He asked me to fix the production line issue. I pop up my laptop screen, log in, run a PowerShell script and say, should be good in a few minutes. About 6 months later, I suspect that Jay was up to some unscrupulous stuff and found all kinds of proof in his email. Sent that off to the plant manager. Jay was terminated the next day.